Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. On the show, I talk to artists, journalists, researchers, other writers, of course, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Today's guest is Dan Hanks, an archaeologist and author of two published fantasy adventure novels, Captain Moxley and the Embers of the Empire, and Swashbucklers, with a new novel recently bought by Angry Robot Books. Welcome to the show, Dan. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So your books have some similarities between them, but let's start with your debut, which is Captain Moxley. It's very much like a take on kind of Indiana Jones sort of subgenre with sort of supernatural elements. What was the inspiration behind it?
The inspiration was Indiana Jones. I went to see the fourth movie way back whenever it came out, 2008, I think. And I came out and thought I could do better, basically.
Brutal.
Which it, yeah, and I've since made my peace with it and I quite enjoy it. But I did come out. I'd grown up on Indiana Jones. I studied archaeology because of Indiana Jones. I've seen those movies so
I think
many
it's got
times.
so many people into archaeology, those movies.
Yeah, which is, and which is funny because archaeology is completely different. But I came out of that movie and, I know the beats of those kinds of stories deep within me. And I knew that, they'd gone missing in this movie to a certain extent, I felt. So I came out and I just I wrote a screenplay just page by page on my commute to work each day, typed it up at night, and then I came up with a screenplay for it, and I thought this is pretty good. It didn't go anywhere, but a few years later, after I got my agent and I got a book deal, which then fell through, which is a whole other story, I thought I really want to write. I need to get another book out there because I was feeling pretty low and I wanted to get something out on submission again. And I was like, I've got this screenplay, so I retooled it and sort of adapted it into a novel, and that's where it came from.
I mean, it's so interesting. I didn't know that, and it does feel really cinematic when you read it, and it does have that. There's like a sense of like it was making me sentimental for the like old style, like kind of 80s movies, and it definitely had held that atmosphere. But and I was wondering, like, so how did you find it? Like, because writing a like screenplay is a very different kind of animal.
Yeah.
Like, how did you find it? Like, changing it into a novel in terms of a storytelling process. Like, what were the lessons you learned from it?
Well, it was really nice having it written. So the story was there, the plot beats were there, the characters were there once I'd sort of, because I wrote it as Indiana Jones 5. But then retold it was like, obviously that's not going to happen. And like, changed the characters and thought about who they were, and with my backing in archaeology, I wanted to bring in that aspect a little bit more, sort of acknowledge the supernatural silliness of fringe archaeology, while also still having some fun with it.
Can you sorry, just to pause here, what's fringe archaeology?
So when I was at university, I did, for my dissertation, I did the flood myth because I really enjoyed the idea of Atlantis, based on the computer game Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, the point and click adventure I played when I was a teenager. And so I found it quite fun, but I found it interesting that had been other flood myths around the world. So I did my
Oh yeah.
dissertation sort of marking each one and sort of looking at the similarities and the
There's quite a
differences.
lot about that in terms of like I'm sure I've seen it in many articles about how there's some evidence that there was like this massive flood at like a particular time which gave
Yeah.
birth to the biblical myth and the biblical story, and then there were the Babylonian stories and all that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's lots of evidence to support, tsunamis and floods throughout history in different parts of the world. So I was while my friends were, studying ceramics and lithics and stone tools and, British archaeology and proper sites and things, and I was looking at all these flood myths in the library. So by fringe archaeology, that's the kind of archaeology that proper archaeologists don't really go near. But I was having fun with it at the time. And now I think there's lots of problematic elements to it, which I wasn't aware of. I've become more aware of it now. And that's certainly some things that have worked their way into this book, because it looks at post-colonial archaeology, you know,
Mm.
going to other cultures and mucking about with their history and their past, and removing it from those countries. Who
Yeah.
owns the past?
I was going to
What?
say actually that like your archaeologist sort of background really shines through in Captain Moxley. And but you definitely hint at there being some issues with a kind of colonial past of archaeology. So like how they have all those attitudes and narratives that are so rooted in kind of colonialism, and like how do we rewrite them, but whilst sort of staying to the, this is an adventure book that is based upon the wonder of discovery of that time period.
Yeah. Well, it's quite interesting, because I think I probably studied archaeology right at the end of it, of that period of traditional archaeology, and not really thinking about these things. And then we started right at the end of my course to look at theoretical archaeology and, objectivity versus subjectivity, and a few of these things began to creep in.
Mm,
Um, and so when I wrote the book, there were elements of that in there, and it was Eleanor, my editor at Angry Robot, who said, "Look, let's tease a few of these things out a bit more." Um, and it was something that I didn't want to go overboard with it, and I wanted to have that sort of conflict between the two sisters, Captain Moxley, and her sister Jessica, who's more of a sort of, I guess, traditional archaeology of the 1950s, and I wanted them to have this kind of clash of thinking, and sort of
mm.
discuss it in the book without
It being
necessarily preaching or taking
pontificating, yeah,
sides. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
It's
sorry, go
it's
on.
it's no, I was just thinking about how it's like it that we're looking at all those things and the kind of Indiana Jones going into the caves and like stealing some ancient artifacts and things like that, and like we're looking at it from a modern point of view and a kind of modern sensibilities. It's it can kind of reframe a whole story, can't it?
Yeah, well, it's certainly, I still love the movies to death, but you do look at them through a new lens. Um, in from our position in 2024, where we're all so progressive.
Yeah, it's I mean, the sort of views, collective views move so quickly these days as well, that I think um it's quite hard to kind of pause and consider things carefully, because it's like there's a constant clash of narratives and clash of points of view, and it feels like you have to stand on one side or the other rather than like talking it
Yeah,
through.
yeah, I prefer sitting silently and listening to people, and certainly pre the death of Twitter, I found it a really useful community to sort of sit back and watch these arguments happen, see people take sides, but
Mm,
some really, really intelligent, articulate voices came through, and I learned a lot from them,
mm.
about, what I should be thinking more about. So all of it's fed into the book, and I hope it makes it for an interesting story, as well as being entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is that. And I thought going back to the kind of to your lessons from the kind of turning it from a script to a novel, because we kind of we digressed a little bit, but I would
We
like to
did.
hear a bit more
Sorry.
about well, I was the one asking questions, but like I would like to just sort of tease a bit more out of that, because
Sure.
um, it's a different mode of storytelling. And how did you sort of approach changing it?
It is. So I enjoyed the screenwriting because it made me focus on telling the story through dialogue, which I don't think up until that point I'd been very good at. I hadn't felt very confident with it. So with the screenplay done, I then had this story being told through dialogue, which I felt worked quite well. So it was really nice to be able to have that sort of skeleton to the story already and the characters, and be able to put it down on paper, or type it up. And so I'd have a particular scene, and I'd have who says what here, and a very small bit of action. And what I love about screenwriting is that you can go, they fight. You don't have to describe it. They fight, they fall off a plane, the plane goes this way, and in a book you have to describe it, and I quite enjoy doing that. And it was nice to be able to sort of know it was going to work on paper and just let myself be free in the way I executed it. Knowing that once I executed this particular scene, it was going to fit together with this scene, and these characters were going to go through their arc in a certain way. So the adaptation I really enjoyed. If I could write all my books with a screenplay, that would be useful.
Screenplay,
but I have
like
to write the screenplay
skeleton.
first. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting because it's obviously there's assumption behind a screenplay is that it's a collaborative process, right? So that you're
I believe it can be, yeah.
you rely on the choreographer to figure out the fight scene.
Oh, well, I see what you mean. Yeah.
You rely on the director to lend a vision to, what the angles are going to be, like what you're going to see, how you're going to see it.
Yeah, it was nice to be able to picture it in my head and put it down, but without directing anyone. So the only times I ever directed anyone was like if a character is saying something, but they're saying it in a tone that's contradictory to the words they're saying. But otherwise, it was quite nice to not have to specify, because I'm like, okay, so someone else will figure out the shot and the way that the character will figure out the way they're going to deliver it, and find the energy of the scene, because that's a whole other process, which is kind of why I went back from screenwriting to writing novels, because once I established in my head that to get a screenplay onto the screen, it has to go through about 1,000 other people. It made writing novels and getting an agent and an editor and getting a book on the shelf that much easier in my head.
Yes, I mean in the head.
In the head. In the head, but I still maintain it's got to be easier than getting a screenplay onto
I mean, I spoke a little bit about that in the episode where I interviewed Maura McHugh, who is trained as a scriptwriter, and she sort of understands script writing from a more kind of practical point of view, and we were talking about how people see the finished products. They don't understand how hard the job of a scriptwriter is, and that you might write the first script and then it's taken from you and you get no credit, and someone else does the second, pass over, or that the show might be even like everything might be done, the show might be finished, and then it never makes it to the
well, we're seeing that a lot more, aren't we?
Yes, which is just astounding, isn't it? You have those multi-million dollar productions that are finished, ready to go.
It's interesting to see what's happening, and I don't envy screenwriters right now, or a lot of the people working on movies.
That being said, though, are you ever tempted to kind of interesting things were happening with Swashbucklers? Did you kind of feel tempted to kind of sort of pitch it as your script?
I'm not allowed to talk about that yet.
See, I thought I would.
I'm so sorry.
I thought I would tease some things out of you, but okay, well, interesting things are happening. Keep an eye out. So, moving on to Swashbucklers, then.
Yes.
You described it as if the Goonies grew up and sort of, having adventures in your 40s. So, like, what? That is still like classics rewritten, and it still has that comfortable aura for people who grew up on the sort of popular culture of the 80s and 90s. It still
Yeah.
has that holds that same atmosphere, but like with a twist. So how did you arrive at that twist?
So again, this is just a really strange way of getting into a novel, but Swashbucklers wasn't the first story I wrote with these characters. So the book that got me my agent, Sarah Megabo, was a book called Panic Stations. And it was these characters, but as kids. It was a contemporary book. And they were basically, I think my sons got really into listening to the Ghostbusters soundtrack on the way to school. And so one day I was driving them to school and Ghostbusters was on. And the words teenage Ghostbusters just popped into my head. And I thought, that's really interesting. So I went away and wrote a book that was basically the Goonies, but as Ghostbusters. And that was the first iteration of the characters who then appear in Swashbucklers. That book sold, but I had so many references in it to pop culture things um, that it didn't end up going forward. It was just too difficult to get, permissions and things, or rewrite it so that it was in a good place.
Oh, so it wasn't just, oh, okay.
So that book sold, but
Even under
then
fair usage. That's really interesting.
yeah, I think I should have been a little bit more careful as I went through. It was certainly, it taught me a lot, that
Mm.
book. I still love that book, and I will retool it at some point. But it was after that sort of fell through, and then I went back and wrote Captain Moxley, and that sold and became my debut. I spoke to my agent, and I'm like, these characters in panic stations won't leave me alone, and I want to tell their story. And I was just like, I really want to tell their story, but as adults. And so we don't see what happened as kids, we just hear about it. And
Mm.
they're back together again, and they went through this amazing experience as kids. But how did it change their lives? How are they feeling about it now? And it just made me think about the sort of the perils and pitfalls of nostalgia, which I explore through
Mm.
the main character Cisco in this. So that was my way in. But again, I wanted to do it in a way that was very Ghostbusters, very Goonies, had that sort of spirit of adventure. There are probably some plot holes in it that we are very used to seeing in the 80s movies, but you went along with it because it was fun and you didn't pay too much
I didn't
attention.
notice any.
Good. I think
I was,
probably some other people did, but it's supposed to be fun with hopefully an element that's a little bit deeper.
it was. And, I really liked that balance between balance or juxtaposition of nostalgia and disillusionment. I felt like you walked a fine line there.
Yeah.
And
Well, just my experience.
your experience. Want to talk about it?
No, it's okay. Unless you want to turn this into a therapy session.
Oh, always, always. I mean, it's interesting because, like, we do, as a storyteller, you're set off telling this adventure, and then you added this other layer of there's more realistic, this kind of saving the world between doing the laundry and the school run,
Yeah.
and with the kind of relationship complexity of adults. And I felt like there was like a lot of nostalgia in this as a kind of show it, not just towards the pop culture of the 80s and 90s, but more like there was, the childhood was easier. Like it was all simpler.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly elements of that I think we can probably all relate to. I certainly could, and I was going through this period in my life anyway, where I was feeling a lot of these things. I mean, this book was a bit like therapy. I think maybe too much, and I had to lighten it up a bit in revisions. But yeah, I mean, you reach, I'm in my 40s, you reach a certain period of your life and you do look back slightly with rose-tinted glasses and you think, I had a great childhood. So, things were great then. Things you could you see these memes going around, but we could go out and play out for 9 hours, and your parents would just yell out the door for dinner, and you'd eventually traipse home just before it got too dark. And that isn't something, unfortunately, I've been able to let my kids do too much of.
I mean, you live in a countryside, so you probably can do a lot more of that than we city folk can do.
Not as much, no. I mean, we did live in a nice estate a few years ago, and the kids were able to go out and play in a little cul-de-sac by themselves. But, you know, when I was a kid, we used to go much further afield, which was great. It was just one big adventure. I loved it.
Yeah, and if some didn't make it back, well, that's life.
As far as I'm aware,
certainly in your book, certainly in your book, that feels like a strong possibility.
That's true. That's true. And that was fun because as a parent myself, I was able to explore, you know, in my head, what if my kids were doing this stuff? How does that feel? You know, what if I was going out and doing this stuff and my kids are at home, and the guilt associated with that? So there's so many layers to what I was trying to do with that.
There was a lot about kind of parenthood. Like, do you feel that? And it's interesting because like parenthood was not really a factor in Captain Moxley as a theme, but it definitely was so strong in Swashbucklers. Is it like what made you kind of turn towards this direction? Because it felt more contemplative in that way.
Yeah, I think there were just things I was thinking about in my own life, and as a parent, I think my kids were at that age where things start to get, you know, they're starting school or moving through the school process. I became to get a bit more involved with school and their schooling, and sort of see them grow up. And I think they were just at that age, and I was at that stage of parenting where these things came together, and I was just thinking a lot more about it.
Yeah, it's I feel like in sort of fantasy genre and sort of science fiction genres, like parenthood is often kind of underrepresented a little bit, and it's especially when it comes to the realities of parenthood. So it's you know, usually if someone is a parent, then it's in order to make them seek revenge for, you know, a dear one's death or something like that, rather than it being well, I'm sorry, I can't stay here discussing our big plot because I need to pick up my kid from preschool.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of comedy to be mined from it, because who among us has time to fight evil?
Yeah, that's a problem, isn't it? Like, kids do have the time, but
yes,
we're not letting them.
Exactly. And maybe, you know, maybe that was part of why the 80s had so many kids gangs running around fighting monsters, was that they had the time and the capacity to do it, and their parents were off working.
Yeah, it's it reminds me of this there's a Paul Simon song where he sings, "You don't need to be wasting your time worrying about the marketplace and trying to save the human race." I think it's like many parents feel that way. It's just like, no, like I can focus on all of this big stuff. Like, I want you to have a simpler and like better existence.
Yeah, I know. It's hard. It's hard work trying to juggle all these things. And I really enjoyed that part of Swashbucklers. It was putting these poor middle-aged people who are very tired, but who had some experience with this evil entity, and how are they going to deal with it now that they have to go to, you know, school plays and things.
Yes, I mean, there's also the like added layer of threat to the story. It's no longer just pure adventure if you have your children to worry about, isn't it? So it sort of makes it, when we talk about like taking the rose tinted glasses off a little bit, there's also that added element of real threats. So we can be nostalgic and it can be like quite fun, and monster is kind of ridiculous and all of those things. But then there's the element of the real threat and the real kind of worry that keeps you grounded. And I really liked that, and I really liked that just juxtaposition in the book. And I thought, like, you do seem to enjoy writing older protagonists in general. Captain Moxley as well. She's not a 20-year-old debutante. She is a somewhat grizzled veteran.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because in the work in progress I've got going on, the thing I'm about to start doing revisions on, one of my main characters is a bit younger, and I think I struggled with that a little bit. And I'm still trying to figure out why, because I can still remember being in my 20s, but I don't know. Because I was able to infuse a lot of my own experiences and my thoughts and fears into these characters in these two books. It made it a lot easier to write them.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to sort of roll up my sleeves with this next book.
That'd be interesting thing to say, like you writing someone a bit more wide-eyed, maybe.
Yeah.
A bit more hopeful.
We'll see. I mean, it's me, so.
But do you think that there's like a particular kind of advantage to writing older protagonists?
For me, yes, because I'm living that experience now. So there's a lot of current emotions I can draw on. In terms of the marketplace, I don't know. I think we need far more older protagonists.
Oh yeah, I think but I think that's definitely, like, I do enjoy writing older people as well in my book. So, and there's definitely an element of filling market. But I was thinking more in terms of actual storytelling process, where you create someone who already has a baggage.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true, because you don't, with a 20-something or a teen, you might not necessarily have the level of baggage, of experience, of maybe weariness and snark to draw on. But then again, you could have, you could have 40-somethings who have not really suffered at all in their life, and you could have a teen who has been through it all already. So that's not, it's not hard and fast rule, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I've certainly found a lot more to draw on for these older protagonists, which kind of makes them a little bit more snarky and world weary, which I love to read. So that's something I enjoy doing anyway, and enjoy reading.
I mean, I was talking to someone recently about when I was interviewed for the Fiction Fans podcast, and we were talking about writing relationships in the books, and the fact that all the difference between younger relationships and how they come across on the page, and what's attractive about them versus what's kind of maybe stale about certain tropes, versus the older protagonists finding love or getting into relationships. Like, what's your, because in Swashbucklers there is like a romantic element. It's not, obviously it's not the main plot line, but there is that. So how did you approach that?
Well, in terms of the romance, the romance I really enjoyed in Swashbucklers is the low key romance between Doc and her wife Michelle, because they just want to go on a date. And it was that kind of, their parents, but also, they've been together for a while, and they're still trying to find those elements of romance in between all this other chaos going on. And they do go on a date, and that was fun to explore. So there was another romance in it, and I think it's interesting to see, because I've certainly gone through that period in my own life where things have changed at a certain point in my life, and things haven't necessarily worked out as I had pictured them, or as the movies normally depict them. And I've seen that with a lot of people, a lot of friends, a lot of people online. And I think there's a lot of scope to have more characters like us who are going through these things, and changing and reconnecting with different people at different stages of their later life.
I think there's a hopeful element in that, which I really enjoy, because it's for all that there's the kind of slightly gritty realism of trying to cope with adventure in the middle age, but that there's also, you know, the more positive and more hopeful aspects of it, and that it's not like the doors don't close.
No, no, well, they don't. And I've certainly found that in my 40s, I feel far more equipped to deal with the world, and I see the opportunities. You know, it's not, life doesn't stop at 40. I think in some ways it begins, and there's so many opportunities, and there is so much hope to change and to be better and to do different things and to have new experiences. And I'd love to see more of that.
Do you feel like you could have written those books when you were in your 20s?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, I had no idea about any of this. I had no idea what it would feel like to be like this. And it's true what people say, you know, you reach this age and you don't feel any different to when you did back then. But I know I am. I know there's no way I had that ability to articulate experience when I was in my 20s. Not to say that there aren't people in their 20s who couldn't do it. I just certainly was not equipped to at that stage.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I really like it when I see people coming into writing a little bit later in life, perhaps as well, because they bring, like, you know, you obviously, it's not just life experience, it's also work experience that you brought into writing your books, for your archaeologist sort of work and your insights from that.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of witnessing changing attitudes as well helps a little bit, because I think, you know, when you started studying architecture, I imagine the landscape was very different.
Yeah, with archaeology, yeah, absolutely.
So
It was.
not architecture, archaeology, sorry.
It's all right. We were in the architecture building, so you're very
Yes.
close. And it was the worst building on campus. It looked horrendous. I think it was from the 60s, just this concrete mass, very thin windows. And we always made fun of the fact that it was the architecture building. It's still there, which I'm secretly pleased about. But yeah, things certainly changed over time. As I said, I think I was at the tail end of the traditional archaeology era. And things were starting to be a bit more, we started to look inward a bit more as a profession. I mean, commercial archaeology is a different thing altogether. It's very practical, it's very scientific. So, but I came through probably just before that started to happen a lot more. We had rescue archaeology units in the country, so they would usually attached to a university. They would go off and dig and rescue archaeology in advance of development. And I think that sort of died away a little bit more, and commercial archaeology has picked up.
I mean, there's only so many old king skeletons that you can find under parking lots.
Oh, if only it was all about that. But do you know what? It's fun because as you know, I still work in the industry a little bit, and it is fun to get these images and see all the work that my colleagues are doing, and seeing, you know, a collection of Roman coins, and seeing the old foundations of, you know, some workers' housing prior to a new development. It's fascinating. I love it.
And there's always more to discover, because it's, you know, thousands of years of development. There's always more to be found, isn't it? I remember
there is, and sorry, go on.
No, good.
I was just going to say there's not always more there's not necessarily just always more to be found, but there's new ways. We're discovering new ways of finding things, and identifying archaeology where we couldn't before,
Mm.
which is really cool. It's a very exciting time.
Yeah, it's I remember in terms of a traditional archaeology, when I was 19 and I went to Greece and I was in Athens, and I remember people were digging, like they were changing some, like fixing some old pipes or something in the road, and they had all this equipment like to change the pipes, and like the digger pulled out this complete ancient statue, like full-size
Wow.
human statue, and they were all like, oh, goodness sake, not again. Like you could see, like there was no sense of excitement whatsoever in them. This is like was a beautiful ancient statue, and they were
Yeah.
all just face palming because clearly this was just going to hold them up again. And
Yeah, well, I was on a dig in Cyprus about, I don't know, 24 years ago. And we were up in the mountains and we were digging, I think it was medieval monastery. And we'd already found a skeleton, and I was carefully, troweling away in my
brushing
little
it.
corner of the site, and I came across some pottery. And I was like, awesome. And it was just like shards of pottery, just a big pile. And I spent the day just sort of carefully scraping and then brushing away, and I was just slowly uncovering it. And then the next day I came back and it had all gone. And the site director had just got rid of it because he was like, we find this all the time. I was so upset.
Oh no, but
But
that's
yeah, I they say it all the time. So, it's not, I guess it's nothing special to them. For me, it was amazing. So I'm glad I got to have
yeah,
that moment briefly
before it was snatched away. That's where all the
before it's snatched away.
disillusionment comes in, isn't
From that moment, that's it.
it?
All downhill from there.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the really difficult bit is like being able to keep the memory of some of that wide-eyed wonderment when you write, like, when you were writing and telling those stories. And it's like when people sort of look at the kind of Tomb Raider stories, in the old movies and games, and now they think like, oh my god, this woman is actually raiding tombs. She's like and there's there's a conflict internally, I think, right now. And like the trick is to try and remember what did it feel like to have this kind of
Yeah.
sense of wonder of being the first people who discovered, like, dug up the old ancient Egyptian tomb.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should say that because they've just released a remastered version of Tomb Raiders 1, 2, and 3. And I remember those games really well. So I've gone back to play them. And it's, there are elements to it which are just plain embarrassing, but that sort of, it is interesting to see how much of that wide-eyed excitement I'm still feeling at some of the moments in the games,
Mm.
because it does take me back to whenever it came out. But yeah, it's funny. I mean, you just going back a little bit, as while I have only got published recently, I've been writing for 20 years, and it's just taking me that long to get my crap together and actually break in. And I think my first characters were, sort of young and wide-eyed and naive, and I think I probably wrote them quite well. And now that we've been talking about this, I'd be quite interested to go back and read those characters to see
Oh, maybe you could
how I did it.
rework some of them. I would be interested
Oh,
in seeing a book
I
that
will.
has chapters of the old hero, like, so end the scenes from the youth, and like just
Yeah.
seeing the attitudes change. And it's I was thinking about it recently because I went on a sort of volunteered on my kid's school trip to the British Museum,
Oh, really? Excellent.
and sort of ancient Greek exhibit, and just walk into this big hall, and it's like, oh wow, there's the Parthenon. I'm fairly sure the whole Parthenon shouldn't be here, but
I'm fairly sure much of the British Museum shouldn't be there, although a lot of it is replicas.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean that's a whole other thing, which pains me because I absolutely love the British Museum and have spent
Yeah.
many a day in there.
I mean, there's a positive side to it as well. It's something I went with my Chinese friend to the Chinese pottery exhibit. It's a sort of and all of that was acquired legally. You know, all of
Excellent.
that pottery was acquired legally at a time where there was loads of it all over China.
Yeah.
And they're like, 3,000-year-old pieces. And there were huge groups of Chinese students, art students, archaeology students, who were visiting the British Museum, and my friend was chatting with them, and they were telling her that you can't see any of the examples of those periods of pottery in China. They were all destroyed
Oh, really?
deliberately during Cultural Revolution. So some of those, some of those 3-year-old styles of pottery only exist now in the British Museum.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something I touched upon in the book, is because, obviously there is a lot that has been conserved and protected for the reason that we have it in the museum.
Although when taken
It's
too far, that can feed into the kind of more the colonial attitudes of we need
yeah,
to protect your artifacts from you.
yeah, yeah.
Which
It's an incredibly complex topic. I mean, there are certainly very obvious good and bad points to it, but that's a whole other show.
yeah, I could definitely chat about that for a long time. But instead, let's turn towards your new book, which has just been announced. Can you tell us a bit about it?
I can now, finally. Yes. So it's called The Way Up is Death. It's a
Very optimistic.
well, it's gone through some title changes. I had very different titles for it, and then each time I came up with a title, someone would come out with a book or a TV show with the exact same title. And so I'd go back to my agent and editor and we'd be like, okay, we need to come up with something else now. So it's a title which I think I don't know if we're moving in that direction with titles which are kind of almost literal. But it was something that I wanted to just have something exciting. There was a title of a book, I think it was called All You Need Is Kill, which then became Edge of Tomorrow, the movie with Tom Cruise and Emily Blunt. And that was a title of the book I really loved, so I wanted to try and go down that direction. Anyway, basically a mysterious tower appears in the skies over the Peak District in England, and it's there for a week and no one knows what it's about. And then all of a sudden 13 strangers from a 300-mile radius are plucked from their lives to appear at its base. And above the opening gateway is a word, and it just says ascend. And they have to try and figure out whether they should go in. Obviously they do, otherwise there's no story. But they have to go in, and they don't know why, they don't know what they're going to face. They just have this one direction, ascend, and they have to climb the tower. So it's a little bit lost.
Really cool.
It's a little bit Squid Game, it's turned out to be. There's some elements of the Poseidon Adventure, which is a favorite movie of mine. There's lots of different things in there, which is it's not any one thing. I tend to mix my genres a little bit,
which is great. It's just going to kind of keep the excitement. There was a show on Netflix a while back. I can't remember the title. It was a sci-fi movie about basically there's this big pyramid, black pyramid that shows up in America, obviously. and nobody really knows what's going on. And so there's this alien life form, and there's like, they might be there to help, they might be there not to help, and the whole tension comes from the not knowing about what it
Oh, really?
actually is and what
What
it
was that
wants
called?
to. Well, I just said I don't remember.
Okay,
If you go on Netflix and look up,
I'll have a look.
sci-fi genre, you'll find it. But it kind of gave me
Yeah.
that vibe, so that's really exciting.
Well, it was
Uh,
something that, sorry, it was something that popped up. I saw this image, which I've since learnt was, I think, AI generated, but it was just a really interesting image of a tower in the sky. And like within maybe 5 minutes of seeing this image, I wrote a prologue, a one-page prologue. And I think I sent it to a couple of people and was like, is this anything? I think this could be something. And then, yeah, it turned out to be something. So I went ahead and wrote the book, and it changed. It had a few iterations in my head. Initially, it was going to be very lost. It was going to be sort of very dramatic and character heavy. And then it sort of turned a bit more exciting and silly in ways.
Without
But I like
giving
that.
spoilers, did you have like an idea for the arc, like early on? Did you know what was going to be at the top of the stairs, or did you discover it as you went along?
um, no. I mean, sort of, but no, not really. And as I thought about it, it became, and now is, more about the journey to the top than what's actually at the top. That's not to say there isn't anything at the top, but it's certainly, I didn't have as much of an idea about what we'd experience on the way up. And I'm mostly excited about that now, the actual journey, which in Lost was one of my favorite things because,
Yes, I
I
mean
mean,
the destination in Lost was like a universal disappointment, wasn't it?
I liked it. I
You
liked
did?
it.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
there's no giant plug in my book that that the devil and the angels have to fight over, or whatever the hell that was. But the character ending in Lost, I really, really loved.
Hmm.
Um, but Lost was about the journey. It was about the excitement of
Yes.
each season and what the hell is happening.
And that's what
And
made it such a powerfully sort of, popular and such a popular show.
yeah, so I've tried to do that, but with planning it out ahead of time, which I believe Lost writers didn't necessarily do,
Yeah,
although I
maybe they
still
just
enjoy
didn't
it.
believe it would last beyond like a
I
third
don't.
season or
I've heard.
something.
Well, I've heard that they did the pilot and didn't think it would get picked up, and then had to then go write a show.
Oh.
So anyway, I
Not
enjoyed it.
thinking,
So
yeah. Yeah,
I did all right.
I like most of it. So Dan, you started a new business venture with your partner Noel Salazar, who's also an accomplished writer, uh, and it's an agency to help aspiring writers. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So we we've been talking about this for a while, and it was something we help each other out with from time to time when we're working on projects. We both read each other's work, and we brainstorm all the time. Um, and I'm coming from a background of freelance editing for the past 5 years with um, writers directly, and more recently with publishers. And between us, we wanted to try and offer authors the things that we were looking for when we were trying to break into the industry, and even
Mm,
after breaking into the industry, after our debut, you still have so many questions at each stage of the process. And we feel, between us, Noelle's got her fourth book out later this year, I've got my third out next year, and this whole other thing that hopefully I'll be able to talk about soon, which I've been doing for 4 years. And we just feel, we don't know everything, but we have a lot of experience to be able to
mm,
offer. So between us, we've got a few services that we've put together, from first chapter critiques to full developmental edits. But also something that we're both excited about is hour-long Zoom calls. So you can just talk to us about
mm.
anything. If you've got a problem in your book, we can try and help you solve it, or we can brainstorm ideas with you. Or if you just want to ask us questions about publishing, um, you know, even
Yes.
if we don't know, we might be able to find out.
It's a bit of a
But certainly through
mystery,
our,
definitely, the industry. And and I think
it can
even
be.
Even when you think back to your debut, and definitely when I think back to my debut, and it just was such a steep learning curve, and it could feel a little overwhelming, and it would have been very helpful to have someone who would sit you down and explain, like, these are the things that will be helpful to you, these are the things you need to look at now rather than in 5 years time, after your book is published.
Yeah,
um so that all sounds really invaluable. So I'll put a link in the
yeah.
description for a video so that everyone will know where to find you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.